let's jump right in. When we think of Steve Jobs, the image that usually pops into our heads is the maestro in the black turtleneck, right? Standing on stage, flawlessly unveiling the next piece of magic that's absolutely going to change our lives. And it's so easy to buy into this myth that he was just born that way. Like he was this fully formed, innate genius with a golden touch from day one. But in today's explainer, we're looking at the source material from Becoming Steve Jobs to totally dismantle that myth. The truth? It's actually way more fascinating. Steve Jobs was absolutely not born a flawless visionary. He was, however, an unparalleled learning machine. And his journey to greatness was messy, full of wild contradictions, and honestly, incredibly human.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's drop straight into a rainy parking lot in Marin County, California. It's December 1979. A 24-year-old Steve Jobs has just arrived, late, by the way, to a meeting at a retreat center called the Garden of Allah. Now, inside, there's a gathering for the Seva Foundation. This is a massive charity aiming to cure blindness in India. The room is packed with world-renowned epidemiologists, spiritual leaders, doctors who literally helped eradicate smallpox. These are serious, heavy-hitting people. But young Steve Jobs, he listens to them debate for a few minutes, stands up, and arrogantly berates them. He literally tells them they don't know diddly about marketing, hijacking the whole meeting until he's finally asked to leave. It's such a crazy contradiction. You look at this brash, insufferable young tech millionaire who just told off a room full of actual heroes. But here's the kicker. Moments after getting booted from that meeting, his friend Larry Brilliant went outside and found Jobs hunched over the steering wheel of his Mercedes, just sobbing. He was deeply vulnerable, instantly contrite, and totally aware that he was way out of line. Actually, he even walked back in to apologize before taking off. And this right here, this is the duality of Steve Jobs early on. You've got this aggressive, demanding know-it-all on the outside, masking a deeply emotional, highly sensitive kid who is just desperately trying to figure out how to channel all that intense drive. Section 1. Roots of a Visionary. Silicon Valley Alchemy. So the crucial takeaway here is that greatness requires the right ingredients, and Jobs had a very specific, almost perfect mix. He was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple who deeply indulged him, really made him feel incredibly special. But it was Paul, a machinist and craftsman, who gave a 5-year-old Steve his very own little section of a workbench in the family garage. Paul taught him a lesson that would define Apple decades later. A true craftsman cares just as much about the unseen details, like, the underside of a cabinet or the brake pads on a car, as they do about the shiny exterior. Now, combine that absolute obsession with craftsmanship with the wild environment of 1970s Silicon Valley, where your neighborhood dads were literal aerospace engineers. That specific alchemy is what empowered a 14-year-old Steve Jobs to just pick up the phone, call Hewlett-Packard co-founder Bill Hewlett, and successfully ask for spare electronic parts. No fear whatsoever.
And that bold approach brilliantly sets the stage for when he met engineering savant Steve Wozniak. This is the first great collaboration of Jobs' life, and the contrast is wild. Wozniak was a pure tinkerer, right? He just wanted to design these brilliant circuits and literally give them away for free to his friends. Jobs, on the other hand, had the vision to package and sell them. In fact, their first venture wasn't even a computer. It was an illegal blue box that mimicked telephone tones so you could make free long-distance calls. Woz designed it purely for the engineering challenge, but Jobs figured out how to package the whole shebang and sell it to college students for $150 a pop. Basically, Jobs was the impresario, Woz was the genius. Moving on to Section 2, the spiritual capitalist, seeking enlightenment. You really have to appreciate the juicy juxtapositions of his life during this era. Back in the early 70s, Jobs dropped out of Reed College, took LSD as a spiritual sacrament, walked around completely barefoot, and, famously, skipped wearing deodorant because he was seeking enlightenment in India. Yet, at the exact same time, he fully embraced this unrepentant, fiercely competitive brand of capitalism, speeding around the California highways in his sleek Mercedes-Benz. He was literally living in two completely different worlds. He was blending the counterculture's rebellious search for meaning with the brutal, hard-nosed efficiency of a corporate titan. But hey, that spiritual search wasn't just some passing hippie phase. It gave him his entire philosophical foundation. Jobs intensely studied Buddhism, which teaches this core concept of becoming, the idea that life is like a ceaseless river, a continuous, ever-changing process. So perfection isn't some static finish line. It is a continuous pursuit, and that belief absolutely fueled his legendary perfectionism. He viewed himself, his company, and his products as being constantly in a state of becoming. He was never satisfied. He was always looking to see what was around the exact next corner. Section 3, Garage to Boardroom, Learning to Play with Adults. $25,000. That right there was the explosive financial leap that changed absolutely everything. Jobs had managed to convince a local computer store owner named Paul Terrell to buy 50 fully assembled Apple I computer boards for $500 each. Now keep in mind, Jobs didn't have a factory, he didn't have the parts, he didn't even have the money, but he confidently took that order anyway, turned his parents' garage into a makeshift assembly line, and just ruthlessly drove his friends and a sister to build the boards on time. That $25,000 order was the catalyst that forced Apple to evolve from a fun little hobby club into a legitimate, real-deal business.
But here's the thing. Jobs knew he couldn't build a massive, industry-changing company all by himself. And this brings us to one of his greatest, yet kind of most overlooked traits. He actively hunted down elite mentors. He brought in Mike Markkula, a former Intel executive who brought crucial angel funding and, let's be real, some much-needed adult supervision. He befriended Regis McKenna, the absolute king of Silicon Valley marketing. He even called up Andy Grove, the legendary operations master at Intel, just to ask for lunch. And Jobs was barely in his 20s. For a guy who famously hated authority and flat-out refused to be a traditional businessman, Jobs was a total sponge, just soaking up wisdom from the giants who came before him. Armed with all this mentorship, Jobs faced his next massive hurdle. How on earth do you sell a terrifying new machine to the general public? Think about it. At the time, computers were these massive, intimidating, room-sized industrial mainframes. The public was genuinely afraid of them. So when Wozniak built the Apple II, which was the first true all-in-one personal computer, Jobs and his mentor Regis McKenna had a huge problem to solve. They had to figure out how to make this scary piece of tech feel friendly.
Well, Jobs is a master storyteller, and you can see it perfectly in a 1977 pitch he gave to a New Yorker reporter. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't start rattling off specs about gigabytes or microprocessors. Instead, he tells the reporter that using a computer is analogous to taking apart 1955 Chevys or using a camera. He completely demystified the technology by comparing the Apple II to approachable, everyday things people already understood. He even insisted that the Apple II be enclosed in a sleek, beige plastic case so it looked like a friendly home appliance, not some intimidating piece of laboratory equipment. It was pure marketing genius. So let's pull all these threads together and loop back to the source material of this explainer, Becoming Steve Jobs. The young man who masterminded the Apple II is the exact same young man who threw that epic tantrum in the parking lot of the Garden of Allah. He was undeniably brilliant, for sure, but he was also immature, highly emotional, and completely unpolished. The beautiful thing is, he didn't stay that way. Our source material maps out exactly how he evolved.
Which brings us to our final part. Section 4. The Art of Becoming, the Learning Machine.
So what does this all mean for us? Why does it matter? Because honestly, the myth of the innate genius is a massive trap. Think about it. If you believe greatness is just something you're born with, you're probably going to give up the second you hit your first real failure. What you should actually take away from this explainer is that greatness is a continuous, gritty process. It's about being an absolute learning machine. It is about recognizing your own toxic flaws, like, say, crying in a parking lot when you don't get your way, and actually figuring out how to manage them. Above all, it's about having the humility to seek out mentors, to call up the titans in your field and ask them for lunch, even when you secretly think you already know it all. And that brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought to leave you with. If life, as Jobs learned way back during his spiritual pursuits, is an ever-changing river, and if greatness itself is a continuous, unending act of becoming, well, what are you becoming today? Are you just resting on your laurels, or are you pushing yourself to evolve into the absolute next version of yourself? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and remember, keep learning.